ancient Egyptian spellbook, squeezed between the lines of a 2,000-year-old text, you'll find some of the most valuable footnotes in the history of language. They're tiny, little clusters of Greek letters hovering above words written in Demotic. They aren't part of the spell, they're pronunciation notes. An ancient scribe, worried that a reader might mangle a sacred word, wrote out how it should actually sound, using the Greek alphabet as a phonetic guide. Those little glosses did something no ordinary Egyptian text can do. They froze the living pronunciation of the language in place, and they mark one of the first steps on the road to Coptic. To grasp why those glosses matter so much, you have to understand a deep limitation of Egyptian writing. For its entire history, hieroglyphs, hieratic, demotic, all of it, Egyptian was essentially a consonantal script. It wrote the consonants of a word and largely left the vowels for the reader to supply for memory, the way you might read Balji and know it says building. That works beautifully if the language is alive in your mouth. But it means the script itself never recorded, in any full way, how words were actually vocalized. So for most of Egyptian, we know the skeleton of a word and have to reconstruct the flesh. We can tell you the consonants of a pharaoh's name with confidence. The vowels between them are, to a large degree, educated guesswork. Even the Rosetta Stone, that famous trilingual inscription that gave Jean-François Champollion the key to cracking hieroglyphics, preserved the consonantal skeleton brilliantly. But the vowels remained stubbornly out of reach. Champollion unlocked the consonants. These papyrus glosses crack something he never fully could, the vowels. This is the great frustration lurking underneath the entire evolution of hieratic and demotic scripts. 3,000 years of writing, and the vowels are mostly missing. It is as if the entire civilization left us its sheet music with the melody erased, and only the rhythm intact. Which is why, when a scribe deliberately spells out a pronunciation using an alphabet that does record vowels, a linguist's heart skips a beat. Those notes are a direct line to how Egyptian actually sounded. The richest place to find them is a body of texts we call the Demotic Magical Papyri, Egyptian spellbooks from the Roman period, roughly the first few centuries CE. The most famous single manuscript is known as the London Leiden Magical Papyrus, so called because the surviving pages are split today between the British Museum in London and the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden. It's a working handbook of magic, recipes for divination, healing, love spells, dream sending, invocations of gods. It was written mainly in Demotic, and it belongs to a wider, celebrated collection that scholars group with the Greek magical papyri, the Papyri Graeci Magicae, or PGM, the great corpus of ancient magic from Egypt. When the Demotic spells were translated and published alongside the Greek ones, they were catalogued as the Demotic Magical Papyri to sit beside them. These are not fringe curiosities. They are some of the most intensely studied documents from Roman Egypt, precisely because they mix languages, scripts, and religions on a single page. It's worth asking who these scribes even were, because it deepens the picture. The Demotic Magical Papyri come largely from the temple world of the south, the same Theban milieu that, as we've seen, became the last stronghold of Demotic under Roman rule. The Ptolemaic period had already set this world in motion, centuries earlier, creating the bilingual administrative culture in which Greek and Egyptian scripts began to coexist and cross-pollinate. And that world's final echo came long after these papyri were written. The very last dated Demotic inscription was carved at the Temple of Isis at Philae in 452 CE. The script's quiet ending, chiseled in stone on an island in the Nile. The men who compiled these magical handbooks were among the final generations of Egyptian priests, still fully literate in the Old Cursive, and they were bilingual to their bones, fluent in Demotic and in Greek, moving between two scripts and two intellectual worlds as easily as breathing. That's exactly the kind of person who would think to reach for the Greek alphabet to solve a Demotic problem. The glosses aren't the work of an outsider fumbling with Egyptian. They're the work of insiders, deeply learned priests, engineering a solution with the tools they happen to command. And because these were living, working handbooks, copied and recopied for practical use, the pronunciation notes were added where they were genuinely needed, on the hard words, the powerful words, the ones you could not afford to get wrong. Now, why would a spellbook, of all things, care so obsessively about pronunciation? Because in this kind of magic, the sound was the power. Many spells hinge on names, names of gods, of spirits, of forces, and on long strings of what scholars call voces magicae, magical words, sequences of syllables, some meaningful, many deliberately mysterious, that had to be spoken exactly right to work. Get the vowels wrong, and, in the logic of the ritual, the spell fails or the wrong power answers. So precision here was not academic, it was operational. And that put the scribe in a bind. Demotic, his everyday script, was superb for fast writing, but terrible at nailing down an exact pronunciation because of that missing vowel problem. He needed a tool that could pin the sound in place. He found one in the Greek alphabet, a fully phonetic system, brought to Egypt centuries earlier that wrote vowels and consonants alike. So this is what he did. Above a demotic word whose pronunciation mattered, he wrote a small gloss in Greek letters, spelling the word out phonetically, vowels included. And here's the twist that makes these notes historically enormous. The Greek alphabet, for all its virtues, was missing a handful of sounds that Egyptian used and Greek simply did not have. So the scribes supplemented it. They borrowed a few extra signs, derived from demotic, to cover those distinctly Egyptian sounds. Greek letters plus a few demotic signs used to write the Egyptian language phonetically. That combination has a name. Scholars call it Old Coptic, the experimental transitional stage that comes right before Coptic proper, the final form of the Egyptian language, written in a Greek-based alphabet with exactly that handful of extra demotic-derived letters. So these little marginal pronunciation guides in a magician's handbook are not a side note in the history of Egyptian. They are a preview of its future. In the margins of a spellbook, you can watch Coptic being invented, one desperate pronunciation gloss at a time. The payoff for linguists is immense. Because Coptic writes vowels, Coptic is the key that lets us finally hear Egyptian. It's how scholars reconstruct the vowels that hieroglyphs and demotic never recorded. That Coptic tradition would eventually branch into distinct regional forms, most notably Sahadic, the great literary dialect of Upper Egypt, and Bohairic, which became the liturgical standard of the Coptic Church. But all of them trace their alphabet back through exactly this experimental moment. And these old Coptic glosses are among the earliest bridges to that key. They catch the language in the act of becoming writable in full. When a scribe glossed a demotic divine name with Greek vowels, he unintentionally left us a recording, a snapshot of how that word was pronounced in Roman Egypt, preserved with a precision the native script could never manage. Stack those snapshots up and you get real, datable evidence for the sounds of late Egyptian, which vowels sat where, how the language had shifted over the centuries, how the everyday speech of the Nile actually rolled off the tongue. And this matters far beyond the spellbooks. Every attempt to reconstruct how earlier Egyptians sounded, the language of the Pyramid Age 1,000 years before these papyri leans, in the end, on the vocalized evidence that Coptic and its old Coptic forerunners preserve. Pull that thread, and a huge stretch of the language's lost music becomes at least partly audible again. A spell meant to summon a god ended up, by accident, summoning something else entirely, the lost sound of a dead language. So step back and look at what these glosses really represent. Two writing systems, meeting on one sheet of papyrus, each covering the other's weakness. Demotic carried Egypt's deep tradition, but couldn't fix its own pronunciation. Greek could fix the sound, but couldn't capture every Egyptian noise. Fuse them, Greek letters plus a few demotic signs, and you get a script that can finally write Egyptian completely, vowels and all. That fusion, born in the margins of magic, matured into Coptic, the last living stage of one of humanity's oldest languages. It's the perfect closing note for the whole evolution of hieratic and demotic scripts. A 3,000-year story that ends not with an ending, but with a handoff. The ancient cursive passing the torch to the alphabet that would carry Egyptian into its final chapter. We followed Egypt's everyday writing from clay and reed all the way to the edge of Coptic, the trainees' exercises, the tax collectors' potsherds, the regional hands, and now the magician's glosses. If you want the whole arc in one place, start with the pillar of this channel, the complete guide to the evolution of hieratic and demotic scripts.